Hey everyone, this is going to be a quick introduction to building plugins for Bubble. So we're going to look at how to add an action to an existing plugin. I'm going to be working on the ChatGPT Toolkit plugin, and we're going to be adding an action that allows this plugin to grab the OpenAI status from their API. So this morning there was a major outage in the OpenAI API. It's still actively out. And one of the features that we've been talking about is adding an action to figure out whether the API is up or down right now. So what we're going to do is integrate this OpenAI Status API into the plugin by using an action within the plugin. So what I'll do is I'll show you how to add the code to call this API and return it to the plugin. And in the process, we'll look at some of the pieces of the plugin editor and how you can add things to a plugin. So it won't be a comprehensive overview to plugins, but I'll try to quickly sort of look at the top level things, and then we'll add this one action. Okay, so if you open up your plugin editor in Bubble, you'll see a screen that looks like this. You've got your tabs on the left, and then you click on one and it will change whatever's on the right here. So the general tab lets you set the name of a plugin, the description, the service URL, some instructions, a demo page, which is where you want people to go and check it out before they install it, and then some categories. So just a high level sort of metadata stuff. The shared tab lets you set things like what version of the plugin editor you're running. Version 4 is the newest one that you probably want to be on if you're starting a new plugin. Whether to use jQuery for your JavaScript. If you want to add headers, whether it's pulling in some JavaScript or API keys, you can do that here. And then some additional keys. So these keys are things like you've probably seen when you install a Bubble plugin, sometimes you can add like an API key for the whole plugin, and that would go here. And these shared assets are if you want to upload files that you need access to. API calls is exactly the same as API connector, so we won't look at that. You can click add an API connection, and you see the same dialog box here to add API calls. I find this is it's useful in some cases, but more often than not, it's useful to add an action, which is what we're going to do. So we'll just leave this alone for now. Elements are when you want to add something to the page that displays, or you want something that operates on the page. So for example, in this plugin, there's a data container object, and it handles all the real-time data updates. And so elements go in here. We won't go into elements right now. And then actions is where we're going to spend most of our time. So I'll come back to this in a minute. Settings are things for whether you've authorized other apps. For example, down here, you can give people access to your plugin, or you can give yourself one of your own apps access. Then you can set up the license. You can set up the development app, which is the app that you're using to test new features. Then you can set a price, and then down here, you'll see your change log every time you publish a new update. So again, it's sort of like metadata stuff for your plugin. If you want to synchronize with GitHub, you can do that here so that your code gets backed up to GitHub, and then you can invite other people to edit the plugin with you. And then finally, you have your reviews page where people can, where you can see the reviews that people have left for your plugin. So what we're going to do is go into actions and add a new action. So we click here, and we're going to call it let's call it get OpenAI status. And you set the name here. This display is what the user will see. So you click OK, and it shows up here. Now note that to make it simpler for searching in the editor, the Bubble editor, I've pre-pended all the action names with ChatGPT Toolkit. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to just copy this and modify the name of this action like this. Okay, so that's our name. Then we have an action type, either client-side or server-side. So the client-side actions run from the page, from the browser. And that's great for if you're doing something just on the page and you don't need to return any data. But more often than not, I find myself using server-side actions. And if you change this back and forth between server-side and client-side, you'll see the main difference in this particular setup for actions is if you set server-side by default, you'll get an async function signature. And if you set it to client-side, you'll get a synchronous function signature. Typically, you want to be using async and await, which is JavaScript syntax for sort of how to execute your code. And so we won't go too much into that right now, but we will in a few minutes. So we'll set it to server side because we're going to return from the action the status of the API. And then you have this category dropdown, either generic plugin, data for things in the database, analytics, or payments. We'll just leave it as generic. It's just a generic action. I don't know if this affects the user side of things. I don't think so, but we'll leave it as generic. Then we have fields and returned values. So fields are things that we can pass to the action, and then returned values are things that we get back from the action. So we know we're going to want to return a status from the action, and we might want to return an error message if it fails. And for now, we'll just create a return value called status. And note that when you create a new field, it will downcase it for you. So whatever you type, say we type in temp and click create new key, it downcases this name, but it keeps the caption. So the name is the reference to that variable in the code. And then the caption is what the user sees when they're chaining a workflow together to like take the result out. So we'll see this in a few minutes. I want to delete this temp one. And so, okay, we have a status. Now, typically I like to build up my functions, my actions step by step. So the first thing I would do here is just create the return block that just returns a dummy string before we even integrate the API. So what I would do here is I would say return, and we're just going to return a JSON object that has these fields in it. If you click show documentation, you can see the sort of internally generated documentation for the action. And so it tells us function run server. So this is what is created on the back end. And that's this block, the whole block that's in this box here. So you never really see this or have to type it, but it says this is called when the action is run in a workflow. So then properties is the object, the input object. So like, let's say we added, let's just add a test input field here. Let's change the caption like this just for demonstration purposes. So this is the internal name and this is what the user sees. Now you can see properties has this test input. And so if we wanted to reference that input, we can somewhere say, we could say, console.log properties.test input. Now note, this doesn't actually do anything because this is running on a server in the cloud, so it's not going to run in the browser. So if you open the console or the web developer tools, you won't actually see this, just as a demonstration. But let's get rid of, you know what, I'll leave the test input now and we'll see what it looks like. We'll start to wire this action up and we'll just see where that test input box shows up. And then we have our returned object, so we have status, and so we can return here status. So you have to make sure that whatever is being returned from this return statement, whatever your return statement where the code execution will finally hit, it has to include this status field. So it's just a JavaScript object, so we could say status, and we could say this is a demo status. And that's a complete function. We could run this and set it up in our workflow. And so let's look at what that would look like now. So if we go over to the test app, which I have over here, we want the editor. So let me pull that over here. Here's our Bubble editor for the test app. So it has the testing version of the plugin installed. So if you are building a plugin, you set up a test app over, you can set it in here and you can set it in settings. And then you'll be able to add that to your app by going to plugins. And you can see here, I've already added it and it has this testing on the end. It just lets you know that it's the current development version. It's not the live version that's running. So what we're going to do is we'll add a new page and we'll call it plugin tutorial. And we'll just leave it cloned from empty. So it'll just be an empty page. And the first thing we need to do is set up some text element to display whatever is coming back from the plugin action that we just created. We'll call this demo page. I'm going to make it a dark page because the text, let's do this one. The text is white, just the color scheme set up for this app. And what I'll do is I'll add two text elements. One will just be a static text that says status, and the other one will have a custom state that it reads from. And when we run our workflow action, we'll set the value coming back from this action that we just set up to that custom state. So on the page, we can say status like this, and it will be of type text. And then this one here will just say status, and we'll have another one. And this value will be whatever is in that custom state. So the demo pages, plugin tutorials status. So by default, it'll just be empty. And then we'll have a button to run that action that we just set up. So click add workflow. And if we search for status, nothing shows up. So this is worth knowing when you're building plugins. It's a little bit confusing. Your running page will update every time you make a change to the code, and you'll get this prompt that we've just updated the page. But your editor page, where you're making changes to the app on the Bubble side, it won't update with the new plugin actions or the new components of your actions or whatever else you're changing in the plugin. So you have to refresh your page when you do these kind of changes that allow the user to do something different in a workflow, let's say. So when we refresh, we can go back in and now I can search for status, and this action that we set up right here will show up as this get OpenAI status. So we have button A, we'll type status, and we'll see here, get OpenAI status. Oh, this is another thing I missed. In the action, we don't actually see any inputs, despite having added this test input field. The reason for that is I just forgot to input a type here. So this editor refers to this bubble editor, and it means what kind of type can the user put in the editor. So when they're building their app, what are the valid types that they're allowed to put in? So your options are static text, static number, checkbox, color, dropdown, static image, dynamic value, app type, information, or an array of keys and values. So static text, static number, these are just boxes that you have to specify the value and sort of concretely. Typically, this is less useful, I find. You normally want to have a dynamic value where the user can set something dynamically from a database call or a custom state or an input box or whatever. Anytime it has to be sort of interpreted on the fly, you want dynamic value. So dynamic value gives you basically all the same options as these static options, static text, static number, static image, and so forth. But it's just more flexible. So we can select a type text or number or an image or a file or whatever. Then a dropdown is when the user is building their app. Then they can pick, the builder can pick something from a predefined list of options in a dropdown. So I'll show you an example. So we'll say test dropdown. Click create new field, and we'll type dropdown or select dropdown, and the choices could be yes, no, for example. And then you could set the default to say be yes. Every field also has this optional checkbox. If the user doesn't have to define it, then you can make it optional. If it needs to be set, then leave this unchecked, of course. And then the last thing is the list checkbox. So if you want to pass a list of values, like let's say you're getting a list of records from your database and you want to set the field to that list, then you would check this. In our case, we're just going to set the test input to be a text, and we'll call this dummy text for the default. You don't have to set this, but you can. And then documentation is what your user will see. So you could say we use this field to set something, and whatever can go in there. And this is just a guide for the user. So now we've set up two test inputs, a text and a dropdown. We're not going to use these for the actual action, but I'll show you in the editor what it looks like. So we'll refresh this now. We'll see our two input fields, and we'll also be able to set up the return of the action, which is this status. We'll be able to say, set it to that custom state that we set up a few minutes ago. Okay, so now if we click on this again, we see our test input and our test dropdown. So we have yes and no, and then we have dummy text in here. So that's what the sort of builder side of things looks like. We can take these out for now. We don't really need them, or we can leave them. It doesn't matter if they're in for our current purposes. So maybe I'll remove them in a minute. And the next step here is we're going to run this action and something is going to come back, which we defined in this status field here, right? So let's say set the state of an element, which is a custom state on the page. We're going to set that status field to the result of step one's status. And ran into the same issue actually where I forgot to set the type again. So you can see we're getting this red text, and it's just because I forgot to set the key type here. So this key type is almost identical to the dynamic value type for inputs, although it doesn't have anything in anything with fields selection, but we have text, number, range, yes, no, etc. So our type is going to be of type text. Often in these actions, you want to return a text field, which is a message of some kind, and you also want to return a numeric value, which is the HTTP status code of the request. So say it's a 400 if it's an error, or it's a 200 if it's a success. So sometimes you would have status message, and then maybe status code, something like this. So we could do this like this and change this around. And then down below, you would have to return these two things now. So we could say status message is this text here, and then the status code is a number. That's a pretty common pattern where you want both of these. So we'll just say 200, which is success. Now, because we've done this, we have to refresh the page again, the editor, and give this a second. Okay, so now that this is reloaded, we can now clear this. We can say set the custom state to the result of step one's either status message or status code. We use message because it's a text and that's what we have on our page. And so now if we change this text here, just so we know what, we know what it's doing, but let's just, for the sake of being explicit, we'll say get status. And then if we click preview, this will reload to our demo page here. And now that we've got our page loaded, we can say get status. And you'll note with actions, these server-side actions take a second to start up. And the first time it runs, it could take 5 to 10 seconds, maybe longer, depending on how big your function is. And the second time you run it, I'll show you here, it's usually very fast because it's already ready to go. But you can see this is the demo status, which is just what we set in here. So now we have sort of a shell of an action that just returns a dummy string. The next step is to figure out from the API documentation from OpenAI how to actually fetch from their endpoint and take the text back. So the way that we would typically do that in this current context is by using the JavaScript fetch API. So the fetch API there's two parts to it. The in-browser fetch API is what most modern front ends use to fetch data from some other server. And so that's probably what's covered here. This is built into all the modern browsers, you can see here. But then on the server side, there's something called node fetch, which has basically the same interface, and you can use it in these plugin actions to get data from other servers. So what we'll do is just say go off to some server, which is going to be this OpenAI status, this OpenAI Status API, and it's going to fetch some JSON payload, and we're going to parse it, and then we'll display it on the page. What we're going to do is write a little block of JavaScript code that says make an HTTP request to the OpenAI Status API, which is this, and it's going to return a JSON payload, and then we're going to parse it and then pass it to the return function in our plugin editor. So we'll pass it out here. And then the next step, which we'll come back to in a minute, is we generally want to wrap our HTTP calls in a try catch block, which says try to do this, but if it fails, return an error message of some kind. We'll do that at the end. So the first thing we want to do is check the API documentation, and it says here there's this JavaScript library, but we don't really need to use that. That makes it a little bit simpler, it says here, with some convenient actions. All we really need to do is make a request to this summary endpoint, which includes all the information we need. But it says here you can display you can make the call either with curl or with embedded JavaScript. Curl here, if you're not familiar, is just a command line tool for grabbing data from the web. So these are the examples they provide, but you can use any way of making HTTP requests. We're going to be using fetch, like I said. So the main thing we need to know is this endpoint. So this is where we actually call the server. So we'll take that over to our plugin editor. So the first thing we're going to do here is just set the URL. You don't have to do this as a separate step, but just to demonstrate, we're going to say const OpenAI URL equals this value. Now this const keyword means constant. So when you set this variable, you can't change the value of OpenAI URL later in the code. So if you have a variable that you're going to change, you would use let. There's also another keyword var for variable, which is less commonly used now, but we'll use const because we're not going to be changing it. And then when we make our fetch call, we will just reference this. You could also just call this URL to make it simpler. So that's the first step. The second step is to figure out how to make our fetch call. So you could, in the old way, just type in node fetch API example. And so we could just grab a random example. The Mozilla documentation usually has good, clean examples. So we could take this and define our function in this way. Or we could go to ChatGPT and say, I want to make a fetch call. So I think ChatGPT might be up now. So say I want to make a node fetch request. Please step 1. And you could let ChatGPT write the code for you. But if it's down, of course, this is not an option. It looks like it's back up, so it's doing some stuff. But let's just let that run and take this example for now. We'll bring it over here, and we'll see what happens. So as the code gets a little bit longer, it's kind of hard to see on these 17 lines. So you can click down here for enter full screen mode and you get a bigger editor. You can also edit in your own editor like VS Code and then paste it back in here. That's one way to do it. If you're working on a complicated code base, that's usually what I do. Okay, so here's our example. There's a few things to note before we modify it. First of all, we have this function signature, which we're going to remove. We're just going to do the logic inline here because it's going to be a small self-contained thing. So we can delete this. We can delete the closing brace. And then we have this const response. So we're going to store the response of the request in this variable. And then there's three parts to this line, or this right-hand side of the expression. The await keyword says, do this action and wait until it's finished before moving on to the next line. And this is very helpful in JavaScript because by default, it will just send off a bunch of actions and things come back when they come back. You have this asynchronous environment, and that can be difficult to debug the control flow of your script and sort of figure out the order that things are happening in. You can end up with race conditions and things. So using await means like execute this action and wait before moving on. Then fetch is our action. It's going to fetch from the server. This is a method. And then we pass the URL. And so we've defined our URL up above, so we'll just replace that. And then the next line is pulling out the JSON data from the request. So the request, from the response. So the response will have a status code and some metadata, and sometimes there's just text instead of JSON attached to it, so you could do response.text. But typically you'll use response.json to pull out the data from your request. And we'll call this, just for clarity, response.json. And then we're not going to log to the browser console like I said before. We're just going to return response.json here. And if this is sufficient for this action, if we don't have to provide any other headers or API keys or anything, then we should get a big block of JSON, which is defined here. This is what the response should look like. We should get something like this displayed on our page. So if that's the case, great. And if not, we'll have to do a bit more debugging. But if it is, then probably we're going to want to pull out something like this, like partial system outage. And there might be somewhere documented where it tells us what the list of possibilities are here, but we'll look into that once we've got the parsing set up. Okay, so we'll close this up. We have our function defined. Let's try to, actually, we don't need to reload the editor. Nothing has changed on the editor side, but the thing coming back should have changed. So we'll reload our runtime page and see what we get back. So we click get status. See, it takes a few seconds the first time, like I said, and in a couple seconds it should show something down here. So here we get an error. So the error we got, this is informative, is it says we expected a string, but we got an object. And so here's the data. Here's what's actually come back from the request and then parsed into JSON. And we can see we get the right data, it looks like. We've got page with the name and the URL and so forth. But this doesn't work for us, right? Because the JSON object, when we pass it to our return function, it breaks it. So for the sake of illustration, what we can do is we can force that object to be a string. We're going to parse it in a minute properly, but just to show you one hack you can use when you're debugging, what you could do, you could say something like, let me fix this indentation here. You could say const response text equals, and then we can use this method called json.stringify and then pass response JSON. And this stringify method, this JSON package has this stringify method that just takes whatever JSON object you pass it and just tries to escape everything and turn it into one long string. And then we have to tell it, instead of returning that JSON, we want to return response text. And then we'll refresh here again. And now it should run quicker because we've just run it a minute ago. It should come back pretty quickly. You can see it does. And we don't see anything, actually. So this is a different sort of thing going on. This probably means that it worked. Yeah, if we click on inspect and click on the page, we can see here's our text. The reason it's not showing up here is just because in the editor, we didn't set up the display of the element such that it can be displayed on that page. So we can fix that by setting the page to a column, and then we can set this to not be fixed with. Basically what happened is the long string couldn't fit in this element. So we just make it not fixed with, and then if we reload, it'll show up. So we do it again, get status, and it should show up right here. And here it is. So this is the string with all of the data that we saw before. And the status is probably what we want. Status operational. So it's probably worth remembering that operational is the success code. So now that we have this coming back into the plugin action, we have to decide what to do with the data. So we have a few different options. We could return the whole thing to the user and then let them do whatever parsing on it that they want, or we could return subsets of it. So when you're creating an interface for your user, it's helpful to think about what they're trying to do with it. In this case, what we're trying to build in this action is a simple way for users to figure out whether the OpenAI API is down or not. So in our case, probably the most useful things is this status here. So in the response, there's several different components. There's this top-level page response. There's a status object. There's a list of components, which I'm guessing are as an event goes on, this probably gets updated. If there's been a recent incident, maybe components get added. I'm not certain about this. Then down here, we have a list of incidents, and then we have these scheduled maintenances events. So this field here. So probably all of this data is not useful. Some of it's not important probably for our actions. So I think scheduled maintenances, incidents, and components we can probably ignore and just use this top level status field. So in our response over here, status is down here, and you can see there's two components. There's an indicator and a description. The indicator is none, and the description is all systems operational. And over here, the description is partial system outage, and the indicator is major. So my guess, based on reading this and this together, is that if there's an indicator, that means that there's something wrong. So maybe there's minor and major indicators, and then there's also, it's none if there's nothing wrong. That would be my guess. So for the first component of the return value from our plugin, we'll look at this field, and we'll have a field on the response that says, is API operational, or something like that. And if this is none, it will be yes, we'll assume it's operational. If indicator is not none, then we will assume it's not operational. And then we will probably also return this description so that a user, a bubble builder, can determine if it's a partial system outage. Maybe they try the request a couple of times, or depending on what their setup is, maybe they do nothing, right? So let's use these two fields as our key indicators. So we come back to our plugin editor. We now have this, we'll get rid of this text object for now because we're not going to use that. For now, we'll just set this to response JSON. We're going to return probably, let's change it here now, actually. Let's say, is API operational? And that'll be a yes, no, based on that indicator field being none or not. And note, this is just a developer sanity thing. Here, I've set these to use camel case. And if you're new to coding, camel case is, you start with a lowercase letter, and then each word, there's no spaces or underscores. Each word or new major component of the variable name is a capital letter, so status, and then message with a capital M, status capital C for code. This down here is called snake case, where you use underscores in place of spaces. Most programming languages, you can't have a space in your variable name. You can't do this. And so the way of sort of breaking up a variable name that has multiple pieces is either, well, you could let it all run together and just make it one long lowercase string, but that's kind of hard to read. And so at a glance, this, with no spaces, no underscores, and no capital letters, this is kind of difficult to read. So you can add underscores like Bubble does by default, or you can use capital letters. Because this is one of the key variables, and we want to be able to read it at a glance, let's use snake case as suggested by Bubble, but we'll take off the question mark from the internal name of the variable. We'll keep it on here as a prompt, as sort of an indicator to the user, but we don't need to set it here. And then to be sort of safe, we would do this. This will work if you mix the two styles, but just to keep it consistent, we'll change it all to snake case. So then down here, these variables don't exist anymore. So we'd say status message and status code. And we would also want to add now is API operational. And that would be is API operational. And so now that will return. We're not setting a default value here. We can't set a default return value. This needs to have a type of number. So this will fail. So you could stub a default one in the code while you're testing, but let's just see if we can pull it out from the JSON without sort of mocking it up. So let's say is API operational is equal to, we have to say const, is API operational is equal to, and then it will be response JSON, and then you can drill into your JSON objects with a dot notation. So this means like grab sub objects or fields from my JSON. And if we come back to the spec, it's in the status object. So it's going to be the response.status.indicator if we're correct, and it should be of type text. So status.indicator. So this would return a text value. What we could do is we can say, instead of returning whatever's in the JSON, the text string, is we could say we're going to return whether or not it's equal to none. So this will be set to true if it's none, and it will be set to false if it's anything else. So, or yes or no in Bubble parlance. So if we do this, then what's returned will be a yes/no value as we defined here. And then we're just going to get rid of this status message. We don't need this at the moment. We can leave this. What we could do is we could just sample. We could just have a dummy text here in case we want to use this field in a minute. Come back to our development app and reload again to update the interface for the developer. And then we come back to our workflow. And now here, we're going to set the status to the result of step 1 is API operational. Now, note this is a yes, no. Just a second ago, I changed in the, this was a text, this custom state status was a text before. So if this was still a text, then when you try to modify your workflow, the type doesn't match anymore, so you get this red text. So what you want to do is set your type to match whatever the return value is. So yes, no. And then your text will go blue. And even though this is yes, no under the hood, if you display it on the page, you will see text. So it will display it intelligently. So we'll click get status and it will go off. And if we set this part up correctly, we'll see yes. So now we can say the API is operational. So that's the first component that would be useful probably by itself. But just to round this off, we will also add the description, this one here. So we come back here, then we can assume that this component of our parsing is correct. So we can just duplicate this. We can say, let's call this status description instead of status message, make it a little bit more explicit. We'll say status description and come back here and we'll say status description equals this dot description. And we're not converting it now to a Boolean or to a yes, no, so we'll get rid of that equals none line. So now we're returning the text in the description. We can change this now to not be dummy text. We'll say status description. So I think everything looks good here. We have our variables defined, pulling out of the JSON. We're returning them here. And then these two variables are also defined up here. This I've changed status message to status description. So we'll see it properly in the builder view. So if we refresh our builder view, we can come to our workflow and we can set the state on the page for the status description. We can set it to the result of step 1's status description. And then on page, we'll change this second text to read that status description custom state. And now if we preview, we should be able to go fetch this JSON payload, parse it, return it from the plugin, and display it on the page. So let's see. We get status yes and status description, all systems operational. So everything seems to be working from the data parsing side. The last thing to do would be to set up a try catch block. So sometimes for whatever reason, your actions will fail. Maybe the server's down that you're making a request to. Maybe your something that the user has input is formatted incorrectly. There's various ways that your action could fail. So the first thing I want to do actually is get rid of these dummy inputs. Then, so the typical way that you handle error handling in JavaScript is using try catch in JavaScript. And so you can bring up, there's various documentation for this on the web, but basically it looks like this. You have a try and then your main logic, and then a catch, which will raise this, it'll capture this error object, and you can do something with it, like return the error message, for example. So I'm just going to take this scaffolding and make this bigger. And so here's all of our main logic, right? So what I would typically do is something like this. You paste in the try catch. We could just do it manually. It might be cleaner, but actually I'll just do that. I'll leave that there for reference, but I'll just say try, and then you open a curly brace, and all of this would come over, and then we close our curly brace for the try component. And then you have catch, and there's this error object. This can be called whatever, but generally it's ERR for error. Then you have another curly brace block, and then here you can do whatever you want if things go wrong. So what we probably want to do is return a similar object as we're returning in the success condition, but things we'll set them differently. So instead of returning the variable, we'll just set this to false. So the tricky thing is here now, if there's an error, we can't be sure of which component is causing it. It could be the parsing here. It could be that the URL is incorrect. It could be that this API has moved or something. So on the one hand, we want to tell the user that the API operational flag is no, so that it's not a success message. But on the other hand, we can't be certain that it's in fact down. So you have to make a decision. In this case, I'm going to say that if this action fails, we're going to return false. We're going to say it's not operational, even though that might not quite be true. But what we'll do in the description is we'll say there was an error checking the OpenAI Status API. And it's not clear what's going on, but at least there's a message that something went wrong, and we're not sure that it's up. And then the status code we'll return, we'll say is 500. Error codes with HTTP, some of them have different meanings. So 400 is a sort of catch-all for something has gone wrong. 500 is there's something wrong on the server. So maybe a 400 is more appropriate here. Sort of depends on how you're thinking about the semantics of this error action. For now, let's leave it at this. This might change after I release this. Maybe there's an improvement to be made here, but for now, we'll just say the API is not operational, and this is the message. So now that we have this, I think basically we're ready to retest it. We shouldn't have to change anything over here. Where you would use these error conditions in the status code is what you could do is in your workflow, you could say only when, over here. So in this step, we're doing something either on the page or with the database or whatever. And what we can use that status code for is we can say only when the result of step one's status code is 200. So this says only when we get a success message back from the action will we do whatever. Alternatively, a common pattern is you can have another branch of your workflow that says only run when the status code is greater than or equal to 400. So this means basically any error messages usually have an HTTP code of something in the 400 range or the 500 range. So you could say if the number is greater than 400 or equal to 400, then do whatever error handling logic you want. If you want to have a path that only runs on success, then you would say if it's equal to 200. So that's basically it. That's a quick overview of how to build a simple plugin action in Bubble. I'm probably going to be releasing some more advanced tutorials in the same space that use sort of dynamic data updating and things like that. So if you're interested, stay tuned. And if you're interested in talking to other people that do this kind of stuff, feel free to come join us on our Discord server. I'll link the community below, and happy building on Bubble. Thanks.